I think we're about ready to go. So Ellie, if you wouldn't mind, Ellie, as people will have read, is one of our graduate award winners. She's nearly at the end of her PhD. She says she's going to be finished in 2 weeks. I'm sure she is, but I've heard that so many times before and it turned out to be a bit longer. But I'm sure you're going to be fine in your hut in Shropshire, Ellie. Ellie's going to talk about prison segregation. I suspect not too many of us have direct knowledge of prison, not on the inside anyway, although I know Professor Medeiros has, though not for any criminal misadventure, but he'll probably explain that himself. Ellie, why don't you talk to us?
Yes, perfect. Thank you. So first off, thank you so much for having me this morning. Really, really delighted to be speaking to you and feel really privileged to be one of the CSAR award winners this year. So I am coming to the end of my PhD, which is in criminology and law. And I've spent the past few years researching segregation in prisons and how the law might work in these special units and potential avenues for reform. So I do have a PowerPoint, which I will just share with you now. There we go. Sorry, bear with me. Perfect. So hopefully you can all see that, but do shout up if there are any technical problems. I became interested in segregation during my master's when I researched radicalisation in prisons. And I found that segregation units held a disproportionate number of Muslim prisoners. It was about 50%. And segregation appeared to be a place for managing radicalisation risks. So I became interested in how segregation is used and why, what it can achieve, and some of the failings and some of the promises and what could be changed about it. So this is a very short 10-minute presentation, and I'd like to take you through the basis for the research, talk a little about how segregation is defined and used, and then I'll briefly take you through my fieldwork and some of my findings. Segregation is a rather general term. It means the removal of an individual away from the general prison population. Typically, it's in a separate unit, although it can sometimes occur on the wing, where an individual is kept in their own cell and not allowed out for association. The term is also known as solitary confinement or isolation, and generally it's confinement alone for about 22 hours or more a day. It's used for lots of different purposes: to ensure good order or discipline in the prison, for an individual's own interests, or for those awaiting an adjudication hearing. The latest published figures show that about 2% of the prison population are held in segregation, so that's about 1,600 people. And I think there's 3 reasons why the research felt important to me. The first is that segregation is really damaging for people's mental health and well-being. Research from the USA, Canada, Scandinavia all found that segregation can cause or exacerbate PTSD, depression, anxiety, and increases the risks of self-harm and suicide. And second, segregation does not improve post-release outcomes. There's lots of research which says it's been associated with greater incidence of institutional misconduct and higher rates of post-release offending in the community. And third, there's a significant moral dimension to it. After the death penalty, it's the most extreme sanction a state can impose. And they are places where there's a history of physical and psychological abuse. So it's important that there's strict procedural and legal safeguards to monitor and control this usage. So I was quite interested in how those safeguards work in practice. I had 3 main research questions, which were: how is segregation used and why? How is segregation experienced by both prisoners and staff? And how does the law interact or shape that usage and experience? I did my fieldwork in HMP Whitemoor, which is one of 8 high security prisons in the UK, and it houses about 430 men. I was based in the segregation unit from February to May 2019, and the unit had about 30 cells. I interviewed 44 people in total, 25 prisoners and 19 staff, and observed general prison practices and decision-making and document reviews. Moving on to my findings, which will be a very brief whistle-stop tour because of timing, but in terms of usage, currently there's a real misconception in about the way segregation is used, or how it should be used. Some policymakers and academics suggest that segregation is reserved for punishment for those who are the most violent in prison, but I found this not to be the case. So about 50% of my participants had engaged in non-violent conduct. So for example, they jumped on the netting, which separated the levels within the prison, to engineer a move to segregation in the hope of securing a transfer out of the prison. And often, in my experience, they were successful in getting their transfer. About 1/4 were there for their own protection, and that was because of self-harm or suicide risks, or because they were avoiding some quite complex dynamics on the wings. 15% were there for lower level infractions. So things like one prisoner had kissed an officer, another one had brewed hooch on the wing, and another one had possession of a mobile phone. And then it was only about 10% were there for traditional punishment purposes. So they were involved in violence, but that was about 3 out of the 30 in the unit. So my findings challenged the existing paradigm that segregation was there for the most violent individuals, and it highlighted some failings in the current system. So segregation was being used by prisoners as a means for progression to get out of the prison, but that was never what segregation was intended to be used for. When it came to the experience of staff and prisoners in the unit, I found that staff were a very close, tight-knit group, and it bred at times what I deemed to be an unhealthy culture in the unit. So staff were sometimes withdrawn, punitive, and they were quite ambivalent about forming right relationships with prisoners. And this culture was driven by 2 things. The unit is physically separate, so it's treated as a discrete unit with a substantial amount of discretion and not a huge amount of oversight. And second, it was the same staff group that worked in the unit. They socialised together. There was a camaraderie that extended beyond the prison walls. And they had a group identity. So they had in one of their offices a hashtag #SegBoysForLife. And this tight-knit group staff culture, well, it created sort of us and them attitudes between staff and prisoners, but also staff in the unit and staff in the rest of the prison. And these close relationships made it difficult for accountability. So staff had to hold their peers to account, but that's much more difficult when you're working with your friends, and it's much harder to call out behaviour which might cross the line. And nearly all staff described feeling fearful in various forms, a fear of not knowing what was at the other side of the door, or a fear of assault, and I observed lots of assaults, a fear that they were somehow losing their sensitivity and humanity, and becoming like prisoners. To deal with those fears and psychological difficulties, staff developed some dysfunctional coping strategies. For example, they used dark humour to mask their fear. They kept their distance, both sort of physically and relationally, from prisoners to try and minimise the risks that they faced. And when it came to prisoners' experiences, I witnessed a physical deterioration, but also deterioration in mental health. So people lost weight, they had trouble sleeping, they described feeling depressed and frustrated and angry. But prisoners also described a fear, but that was associated with them being so vulnerable and so reliant on staff. It was a fear that staff would come to their door and they would come in their kit with their shields and their helmets and would assault them. The unit was characterised by a complete erosion of agency and bodily autonomy. Staff dictated when a prisoner could shower, when they ate, when they went to the exercise yard, when they had their telephone call, and when they got clean clothes. So there's a total control and extreme isolation. I'll just give you a moment to read that slide. So these, my research was qualitative and based on transcripts and interviews with staff and prisoners. So I'll let you read that quote. So there were lots of rules and processes in the unit, and legal safeguards took the form of various approval processes. So a governor and a mental health representative had to review and approve the initial segregation. The segregation then had to be reviewed after 72 hours and then at regular 14-day intervals. And for prisoners kept beyond 42 days, external approval had to be sought from HMPPS, which is prison service. But despite there being lots of rules and lots of processes, they did not always lead to fair and transparent and consistent decision-making. So prisoners tended to be placed in segregation for quite different reasons, for varying periods, and received quite differential treatment. The rules and processes, like segregation review meetings, which happened every 14 days, were dismissed by both staff and prisoners as being superficial safeguards. And importantly, staff were the gatekeepers to legal rights. So staff could dictate when a prisoner accessed their legal representation, whether they could engage in the complaint process or attend segregation review meetings. And staff at times relied on the rules to justify what could be perhaps cruel practices, so withdrawing blankets. But at other times they could use the rules in ways which gave informal privileges, like extra food. The rules and processes were hollow at times. For prisoners, they represented a form of legal authority for staff decisions, but did not bring a sense of legitimate authority to staff or the institution. The rules were experienced as manifestations of penal power. Rules and laws were there to justify staff control. And just some brief concluding comments. Again, I'll just let you read this quote. During my time in Whitemoor, both staff and prisoners were frustrated, depleted, and cynical about the use of segregation. And it was a really hard and harrowing environment for all who were there. The unit was a violent place, self-harm, suicide attempts, property damage, dirty protests, verbal abuse, all common. And it was also characterised by an entrenched and what I think somewhat dangerous lack of faith in humanity. Prisoners were considered and treated as violent and risky. They were othered and dehumanised. And when we treat individuals this way, there's a risk that they can internalise this view and adopt the very behaviours that the unit is trying to mitigate. So measures like segregation, which are designed to reduce the risk of violence, maybe perpetuating it, and I make sort of the concluding argument in my PhD is that the law and legal apparatus, by rendering segregation decisions lawful, sustain this violence, punitiveness, and contribute to normalizing its use. And this creates risks for the prison in terms of order, but also the rest of society. Desmond Tutu once wrote that the greater whole of humanity is diminished when we agree that others within it can be humiliated, denigrated, or treated as anything less than human. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. I really welcome any questions. I appreciate that I blitzed through that for time. So sorry, but I think, yeah, you have a bit more time to read that quote there.
Ellie, that's absolutely great. Thank you very much. I'm a huge fan of qualitative research, I must say, because you can really get under the skin of what's going on, which you've clearly done. I think we've got time for one or two questions. I think John Cook has a question.
Ellie, that was a fascinating, disturbing talk. Is there a connection between going into segregation and suicide and self-harm among the population, or attempts at suicide and self-harm?
Yeah, so there is. So the evidence suggests that there are higher incidents of self-harm and suicide in segregation units, and I think it's like 6 times more likely to commit suicide in the unit. But it's a bit tricky to untangle whether that's just because the unit holds a population that's already at risk and vulnerable to self-harm and suicide. So perhaps they've been removed from the wing because they were already presenting as risky for self-harm, and therefore when they move to the unit, then there's greater incidence of self-harm. Or whether the unit itself can create or exacerbate those risks. The evidence hasn't quite been able to unpick that yet, and it's really hard to do that in prison because you can't really get a control group, so you can't follow people through very easily. But I think overall, kind of the research as currently stands suggests that that segregation units do have a detrimental impact on people's mental health and well-being, and can contribute to increasing the risks of self-harm and suicide.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Ellie. I'm going to sneak in one question of my own, if I may. Presumably, this segregation has different effects on different people, and I wonder if there's any way you can anticipate the effect. So some people may be terribly vulnerable to it, and others may be fine. I like being on my own.
And I think it's really, not to kind of tread the middle ground, but it is really difficult to prove that scientifically, because sometimes you have people who go to segregation, and some studies have reported an improvement in mental health and well-being, so a lowering in depression and anxiety. But I think when that might be because what I've seen in their studies is that it's quite a turbulent, violent prison wing that you're leaving. So then when you move to a segregation unit where you're in your own cell, you don't associate with individuals, you're not at risk of violence from the prison population, from the other prisoners, then perhaps that might have a positive impact for some. But it's kind of like, well, that's the lesser of two evils. So I wouldn't advocate that it can have an improvement or a beneficial impact on some people. But the kind of adaptation in segregation is different for many people. And I think it depends on general prison experience, the type of prison it's happening in, people's sort of criminal histories. Like if people have spent a longer period in prison, perhaps they've had greater exposure to segregation, then these kind of psychological or physiological impacts might be lessened to a degree. But again, it's the studies, there's been quite a bit of disagreement within the existing literature about the impact of segregation units, and it's really hard to show scientifically what that is.
Fascinating. Well, I'm sure it's good work, and it has the chance of giving people rather better lives, which presumably is the purpose of this, one way or another, both prisoners and the staff, of course. So thank you so much. Fascinating insight to a world with which, as I say, many of us are not particularly familiar. Thank you so much.